All right, guys. So, our next discussion for this week is going to be on populations, growth, and carrying capacity. So, we're going to look specifically at populations, their growth, their carrying capacity, and then we're going to touch a bit on population regulators. So, populations. A population is defined as a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same geographical area. It's important to note that you can have separate populations that are in close proximity but may be divided by specific things, and we are going to talk about that later. Population density is defined as how organisms within a population are spread out or distributed in their environment relative to each other, and this will vary from species to species based on behavior and resources. So it's just how many live within a certain area. So think of like a block. Sometimes you can have a block with a bunch of people living in tall apartments, and other times you have a block with just a few large houses. And so there's less population and less density when you've got those spread out houses as compared to the apartments. So when we talk about population distribution, and that is how that density is spread out, we're going to talk about three types of distribution. The first type is called random, and this is when the position of one organism is completely independent of the others, so they end up spread out with no specific pattern or system. Now, this is pretty uncommon, but it can occur when there's unpredictability in the environment. So, this can happen to a lot of marine animals and organisms where the conditions that they need may get jumbled or tides pushing them in and out, things like that. The second type of distribution is clumped. This is when organisms group together, and this is most common in nature, especially with social or herding species. So, this is when they'll group up in tight clusters as opposed to spreading out. And then, last but not least, we have uniform, and this is when organisms are evenly spaced to maximize the distance between them. And this is really common in territorial species. So, when organisms need their space, they will have a very even spacing because each one controls essentially so much territory around them. So, that's population distribution and populations in a nutshell. Next, we're going to talk about population growth. Now, don't freak out. It's going to look a little confusing, but it'll make sense once we talk about it. So, populations tend to increase in size over time, and we calculate this growth number by looking at gains and losses within a population. So, your number of organisms, and I put it as an equation here, but you just think of it in general terms. Your number of organisms is equal to what you started with, so your previous population, plus your gains for that time period. So it's birth or immigration. Remember, animals can join, they migrate or mate and come into a new flock, things like that. And then you're going to subtract from that any losses. So any deaths and any immigration. So, like with a wolf pack, how they sometimes will break off to form their own. So those get taken into account. If we have a positive rate of change, that means we're growing. And if we have a negative rate, then we're declining. And to calculate that rate, we're actually going to look at a much simpler form of the equation. We're just going to look at the gains minus the losses. So the birth and immigration minus the death and emigration. So that is how we determine growth, how we measure it. And that time that we look at for this rate, that can be anything from a few months to years, depending on the organism you're looking at. Now, biotic potential is what we call the capability or the capacity to increase. So it's the ability to increase and how much it can increase. We're actually going to look at an exponential growth activity, and that's where we'll look at what happens to species that can grow very rapidly and also the sustainability of that rapid growth. So that's relating back to the potential, because you can only grow so long as you have resources to do so. So exponential growth I know it sounds like a mouthful, but it just means it's density independent. And this means that the growth is not impacted by the number of already existing organisms. We don't typically see this in nature because, again, these organisms have to share the resources in their environment. So if you've got an organism that's just shooting off and growing a ton and a ton and a ton as a species, they're going to very quickly overwhelm all of their natural resources without an external source supplying more. And that's what actually we're going to look at. We're going to look at some smaller amoeba and stuff and see how they grow. All right, so next is the carrying capacity. This ties into what we were just talking about, because carrying capacity is defined as the maximum number of organisms that can be supported by an environment. When populations near that carrying capacity, we're going to see a change in their growth patterns, and we're going to see it become logistic, is what we call it, logistic growth, and it's density dependent. And what that really looks like, and we're going to look at these graphs in class, is that instead of a one directional graph that just shoots up, we're going to see one that kind of up and down like a little wave as it floats around that carrying capacity. Because anytime it goes over, you're going to see a responding dip since that environment can no longer support those extra organisms. So we're going to talk about a couple different types of limiting factors. We're going to talk about biotic limiting factors, and these are things like predators, disease, and competition. Obviously, predators is predator-prey, eating other organisms. Disease can go through any type of organism, plant or animal, and that can limit how many are in a population at any given time. And then competition is just that fight over resources. For the abiotic factors, we're going to talk about natural disasters, ecosystem changes. So think climate change, think human effects and things like that. And then just literally physical space being limited or resources that are needed. So like nitrogen or sulfur or any of the things that those organisms need. We're also going to look at it from the density point of view with density dependent factors. So these are factors that affect larger populations more. And these typically tend to be related to biotic factors, not always, but often are. And we're also going to talk about density independent factors, and these ones will affect all populations equally. So these are typically abiotic factors. So we've been talking about growth and how, we can't sustain unlimited growth. So let's talk about how we regulate these populations. So population regulators are interactions that help populations regulate. And what that breaks down to is its behaviors and checks and balances, essentially, that are built into our ecosystems. So we're going to talk about 3 specific types of interactions for the purpose of our class. We're going to talk about mutualism, which is when all species benefit. Sometimes this is necessary for survival in hostile environments. Sometimes it just occurs for other reasons. I do want to stop here before we get too far. I know you're going to see mutualism and think, oh, mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism, but you should notice that we've broken it down a little bit differently. So be careful not to get those confused later on. So we've got mutualism as our first one. The next is exploitation. And this is when one species is essentially taking advantage of another. And there are 3 subcategories to this. So we're kind of deep diving a bit more into it. You normally would have thought of this one as parasitism, but there's more nuance there that we're going to talk about. So there's predation. This is one species killing and eating another. So again, that one species is still gaining benefit while the other doesn't. Herbivory, and this is when we've got the eating of a plant, which doesn't always actually kill it. So it can't really fall under predation because you can eat parts of a plant off without destroying the entire organism. And then we do have your traditional parasitism, which is one species stealing nutrients from the host, and that theft typically harms the host while helping the parasite. So that's exploitation. And then finally, we have competition. And this is when species are competing for the same resources and they end up both being negatively impacted. And we talked a little bit about that already, where if you can't settle into a niche where that allows you to sidestep that competition, then eventually one species is going to outcompete the other. And in the meantime, neither is going to have a good time of it.